I was 31 years old the night I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening between Ellis and me. Standing barefoot in my kitchen, holding a bowl of microwave popcorn that was already getting cold, I could hear his laughter drifting from the living room. It was the same laugh I'd been listening to for over a decade, but something about it felt different that night. More fragile, maybe. Or maybe I was finally paying attention. The apartment was dim except for the blue glow spilling from the television screen. I'd turned off most of the lights without thinking about it, the way you do when you want the world to feel smaller, more contained. Outside, October rain tapped against the windows in that persistent way that makes you grateful to be inside, to be warm, to not be alone. Ellis had called that afternoon. He never really asked for things directly, but I'd learned to read the spaces between his words. He'd mentioned his breakup again, how Sarah had finally moved out, how the silence in his place was too loud. He asked if I was doing anything tonight. Just like that. As if it weren't already understood that when one of us needed the other, we showed up. This was our ritual, though we'd never named it that. Movie nights when life got overwhelming, when the outside world demanded too much from us. It had started in college during finals week and somehow survived all the years since. Through my graduate degree, his photography career, our various attempts at relationships that never quite took root. Ellis would appear at my door with takeout, or I'd find myself driving to his apartment with groceries neither of us had asked for. We'd sink into whatever couch was available and let ourselves disappear into other people's stories until our own felt manageable again. But tonight felt weighted in a way I couldn't name. Ellis had arrived an hour earlier, dropped his jacket on my kitchen chair, and claimed the couch without ceremony. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the way he'd looked at me when he settled in. Something searching in his expression before he turned away. I walked back to the living room, the hardwood floor cool against my bare feet. Ellis was stretched across the length of my couch, one arm behind his head, completely at home in my space the way he'd always been. He'd changed into clothes he'd left here weeks ago during his last stay, back when Sarah had needed space and my couch had become his temporary bed. The soft gray t-shirt and dark jeans looked more like him than the carefully coordinated outfits he wore when he was trying to be someone's boyfriend. I handed him the popcorn and took my usual spot on the far end of the couch, leaving the middle cushion between us like a buffer zone I'd never consciously acknowledged until that moment. The first movie played, something we'd both seen before, which was perfect. We didn't need to pay attention. The room filled with that comfortable quiet that only happens between people who've run out of things to prove to each other. Halfway through, Ellis shifted. Nothing dramatic, just a stretch, a yawn, the kind of movement that happens naturally when you're settling in for the long haul. But when he repositioned himself, he'd somehow migrated closer. Not obviously, not intentionally, just the way bodies move toward warmth without thinking about it. By the time we started the second movie, there was barely a cushion between us. I noticed but didn't comment. Ellis seemed focused on the screen, one hand absently playing with the edge of the throw blanket I kept folded over the back of the couch. The space between us hummed with something I couldn't quite name, but I didn't pull away. The third movie was his choice, something quiet and atmospheric that neither of us would remember the plot of later. Ellis had shifted again, and now our knees were touching. Just barely. Just the slightest pressure of denim against denim, but enough that I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric. My breath caught, and in that moment I realized something that should have terrified me, but somehow didn't. This wasn't surprise I was feeling. It was recognition. Like my body had been waiting for this contact, like it had always known this was where we were heading, even when my mind refused to follow. Ellis didn't pull away either. If anything, he seemed to settle deeper into the couch, deeper into whatever this was becoming. In the shifting light from the television, I could see his profile, the familiar line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. I'd looked at him thousands of times before, but never quite like this. Never with the understanding that looking was allowed, that wanting was allowed, that maybe I'd been wanting for longer than I'd ever admitted to myself. The movie played on, but neither of us was watching anymore. The silence between us had transformed into something alive, something that pulsed with possibility and fear and a kind of relief I hadn't expected. Years of careful distance, of never quite saying what we meant, of treating this thing between us like it was too fragile to touch directly. And here we were, our knees barely touching, and the world hadn't ended. I thought about all the nights like this, all the times Ellis had fallen asleep on this couch, while I watched him and told myself I was just being a good friend. I thought about how natural it felt to have him in my space, how empty the apartment felt when he wasn't here, how I'd learned to cook for two without ever deciding to. The recognition settled into something deeper as we sat there, not moving, barely breathing. This was the moment I would remember later as the beginning, even though the beginning had probably been years ago, hidden in glances and inside jokes, and the way Ellis said my name like it meant something specific to him. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we'd talk about this or pretend it hadn't happened, or if something else entirely would unfold between us. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't afraid to find out. I had built my life around certainty, around systems that made sense. My job at the university archives suited me perfectly. Days spent cataloging manuscripts that had survived decades or centuries, organizing human knowledge into neat categories that would outlast whoever had originally created them. There was something comforting about working with the past, with stories that had already reached their conclusions. No surprises, no sudden reversals, just the steady work of preservation and order. My apartment reflected this same need for control. One bedroom, deliberately modest, with built-in bookshelves that I'd organized by subject and then by date of publication. A single reading chair positioned by the window where I spent most evenings. A small dining table that rarely seated more than one. A couch that had been chosen more for durability than comfort. Everything had its place, and I kept it that way. Ellis's life existed in complete opposition to mine. He was a photographer who specialized in travel assignments, disappearing for weeks at a time to document festivals in small towns or architectural details in cities I'd never heard of. When he was working, his schedule became erratic and intense. When he wasn't, he had this way of showing up unannounced with bags of laundry and stories that spilled out over hours. He moved through the world like someone who trusted it to catch him, while I moved through it like someone checking the ground for cracks. We'd met during freshman orientation, both of us quiet in different ways. I was quiet because I was overwhelmed, trying to figure out how to be away from home for the first time. Ellis was quiet because he was watching, taking in details the rest of us missed. I remember him sitting in the back of the orientation session, sketching in the margins of his welcome packet instead of taking notes. He looked up once and caught me staring, and instead of looking away, he held my gaze and smiled like we were sharing a private joke. The friendship that developed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Ellis had this way of drawing me out of myself without making it feel like work. He'd suggest walks across campus at midnight or drives to nowhere in particular, and somehow I always said yes. He introduced me to people I never would have met otherwise, but he never made me feel like I needed to become someone different to belong. What I remember most clearly about those college years was how Ellis never seemed to expect anything from me except exactly what I was willing to give. If I wanted to stay in and read on a Friday night, he'd show up with takeout and read his own book in the chair across from mine. If I was feeling social, he'd know without me saying anything and suggest we meet his photography friends at whatever coffee shop they'd claimed that week. He moved in and out of my space like he understood its rhythms better than I did. After graduation, we both stayed in the same city, but our lives took different shapes. I started my graduate program, then my job at the archives. Ellis began freelancing, building a reputation that took him further and further from home. We'd go months without seeing each other, then fall back into our old patterns like no time had passed at all. I dated occasionally, women who were kind and intelligent and who seemed to understand that I wasn't quite available in the way they needed me to be. Nothing ever developed beyond a few months of careful dinners and conversations that felt like interviews for a position I wasn't sure I wanted to fill. I told myself I was simply too particular, too set in my ways to accommodate another person's needs and preferences. I liked my solitude, my books, my predictable schedules. I didn't examine too closely why none of my relationships ever generated the kind of urgency or longing I read about in novels or saw in movies. It seemed easier to accept that I was built differently, that maybe romantic love wasn't meant for everyone. But Ellis was different. Ellis had always been different. He was the only person I'd ever met who made my carefully constructed life feel less like protection and more like preparation for something I couldn't name yet. When he was in my space, I noticed things I usually ignored: how the morning light moved across the living room floor, how much better food tasted when it was shared, how silence could feel warm instead of empty. 3 weeks after that movie night, when our knees had touched and neither of us had pulled away, Ellis called again. This time, he wasn't asking for a distraction from his breakup. He was asking for a place to stay. Sarah had given him a deadline to move his remaining things out of their apartment, and his lease on his own place wouldn't start for another month. He needed somewhere to crash for just a little while, he said. For weeks at most. I said yes before he'd finished explaining. Not because it was convenient or because I owed him a favor, but because the thought of Ellis sleeping on my couch for a month felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like something I'd been waiting for without realizing I was waiting. He arrived that Sunday afternoon with 2 suitcases, a camera bag, and a houseplant I'd never seen before. A small jade plant in a ceramic pot that he placed on my kitchen windowsill without asking permission. Later, I would think of that plant as the first sign that this wasn't going to be temporary, that Ellis wasn't just staying here, he was settling. Within days, my apartment began to smell different. Cedar shampoo in the bathroom, the citrus tea he preferred over coffee, something warm and unmistakably human that I couldn't identify but recognized immediately. His clothes appeared in my laundry basket, mixed with mine. His books found spaces on my shelves. His camera equipment claimed corners of my living room. I should have felt invaded. For years, I protected my space, my routines, my carefully maintained boundaries. I'd never lived with anyone, never wanted to accommodate another person's habits and needs. But watching Ellis move through my apartment felt less like an intrusion and more like watching something complete itself. He cooked breakfast most mornings, humming quietly while I got ready for work. He was usually asleep when I came home, stretched across the couch with whatever book he was reading that week open on his chest. We developed wordless systems for sharing the bathroom, for deciding who would pick up groceries, for navigating the small negotiations that living together required. What surprised me most was how natural it felt to make room for him. Not just physical room, but space in my thoughts, in my plans, in the quiet internal monologue that had always been entirely my own. I started picking up the kind of bread he preferred, leaving extra coffee in the pot, checking to see if he needed anything when I was running errands. Small accommodations that felt less like compromises and more like recognitions of how I'd always wanted to live, if I'd had someone worth living that way for. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped pulling away. From conversation, from contact, from the possibility that letting someone this close might change me in ways I couldn't predict or control. Ellis was already here, already part of my daily landscape, and nothing catastrophic had happened. If anything, I felt more like myself than I had in years. More present, more aware, more willing to see what might develop if I stopped trying to manage every outcome before it had a chance to unfold. The changes started small, almost too subtle to notice. Ellis leaving his toothbrush on my bathroom counter after the first week, then joking about it when I mentioned we could pick him up his own. He said something about how we'd probably shared worse things in college. And anyway, wasn't I being a little precious about germs? He was grinning when he said it. But there was something underneath the joke, some question he was asking without asking. I bought him his own toothbrush the next day, but I noticed he kept using mine. Breakfast became a ritual neither of us had planned. Ellis was always awake before me, moving quietly around the kitchen like he was trying not to disturb something fragile. I'd find him standing at the stove, still wearing whatever he'd slept in, hair sticking up in ways that made him look younger than 30. He'd hear me come in and glance over his shoulder, and without saying anything, he'd crack another egg into the pan or add more coffee to the pot. We didn't talk much during these mornings. There was something about the early light and the quiet that felt too delicate for conversation. Ellis would hand me a plate and we'd eat standing at the counter or sitting across from each other at my small table, each lost in our own thoughts, but somehow sharing the same space in a way that felt both intimate and safe. I started looking forward to these mornings more than I was comfortable admitting. Not just the food or the company, but the way Ellis moved through my kitchen like he belonged there, like this was something we'd been doing for years instead of weeks. The way he remembered how I liked my coffee, how he'd already learned which cabinet held the plates, how he'd started buying the kind of jam I preferred without me ever mentioning it. 3 weeks into his stay, I came home from work to find Ellis sitting on my living room floor, back against the couch, surrounded by contact sheets and prints. He had his camera in his hands and was reviewing shots from his most recent assignment, something about urban renewal in smaller cities. The afternoon light was streaming through the windows, casting everything in soft gold, and he looked completely absorbed in his work. I didn't announce myself. I just dropped my bag by the door and sat down in my reading chair with whatever book I was working through that week. It felt natural, settling into our respective evening routines in the same space. Ellis occasionally held up a print to show me something he'd captured, and I'd look up from my reading to see what he was excited about. At some point, I became aware of a soft clicking sound. I looked up to find Ellis pointing his camera at me, not the professional one he used for work, but the smaller film camera he carried for personal projects. He lowered it when he realized I'd noticed, but he didn't apologize or explain. He said he liked the way the light was hitting my face, the way I looked when I was completely absorbed in reading. He said I looked more like myself in that moment than in any photograph that had ever been taken of me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I went back to my book, but I was hyper-aware of him watching me, of the possibility that he might take another photo, of how that possibility didn't make me want to hide the way it usually would. Later, after Ellis had packed away his work and we'd shared a dinner of leftovers and whatever vegetables were about to go bad in my refrigerator, I asked him if he was always documenting everything around him. He considered this seriously, the way he considered most questions, and said that he only photographed things he wanted to remember exactly as they were. Things that felt important in ways he couldn't explain at the time. I thought about this for days afterward. What it meant that he'd wanted to capture me in that moment. What it meant that he'd been watching me closely enough to notice how the light was falling across my face. What it meant that he'd described it as me looking like myself, as if there were other versions of me he'd observed that were somehow less authentic. The shift came on a Thursday night in November. Ellis had been out later than usual, working on some project he'd been mysterious about. I'd already eaten dinner and was settling into my evening routine when I heard his key in the lock. But instead of the usual sounds of him coming home, the soft thud of his camera bag hitting the floor, the rustle of him hanging up his jacket, there was only quiet. I found him standing in the kitchen, still wearing his coat, staring at nothing in particular. When he looked up at me, something in his expression was different. Flattened, maybe, like he'd been holding something heavy all day and was finally allowing himself to feel the weight of it. He asked if we could watch something dumb, something that wouldn't require him to think. He said he didn't want to be alone in his head that night. There was something raw in the way he said it, something that made me want to ask what had happened, but I could see that talking wasn't what he needed. We settled onto the couch, closer than we'd been since that first movie night. Ellis chose something mindless, a comedy from the 90s that neither of us had seen in years. He laughed at all the wrong moments, during scenes that weren't meant to be funny, and was quiet during the parts that were clearly supposed to be entertaining. I found myself watching him more than the screen, trying to read what was happening behind his eyes. Halfway through the movie, Ellis shifted until his head was resting against my shoulder. Not gradually, not with the careful testing of boundaries that had characterized our earlier encounters, but deliberately, like he was claiming something he'd always been entitled to. My hand found its way to his hair without any conscious decision on my part, fingers combing through the dark strands in a rhythm that seemed to calm both of us. We stayed like that for the rest of the movie. Ellis's breathing gradually slowed and deepened until I realized he'd fallen asleep, his weight settling more fully against my side. I could have woken him, suggested he'd be more comfortable in his own bed, but I didn't want to. I wanted to stay exactly where we were, with his head on my shoulder and my fingers in his hair, and the television casting its shifting light across both of us. Something old stirred in my chest as I sat there, something that had been buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it didn't exist. It wasn't desire exactly, though desire was part of it. It was recognition, the same feeling I'd had that first night when our knees had touched. The understanding that this was what I'd been moving toward all along, through all the careful distance and the relationships that never quite worked, and the life I'd built around avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability. Ellis slept for another hour. I didn't move, barely breathed, afraid that any shift in position might break whatever spell had settled over us. When he finally stirred and lifted his head, blinking in the blue light from the television, he looked at me for a long moment before straightening up. He apologized for falling asleep on me, said he should probably go to bed. I told him it was fine, that he should sleep as long as he needed to. What I didn't say was that having him fall asleep against me felt like the most natural thing that had ever happened in my apartment, that I'd been more content in that hour than I could remember being in months. After Ellis disappeared into the bathroom to brush his teeth, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at my reflection in the dark surface of the microwave door. In the distorted image, I looked different somehow. Softer, maybe. More open than I usually allowed myself to be. I whispered to my reflection, "What are we doing?" But what I really meant was, what am I afraid of? What was I so determined to protect myself from that I'd spent years building walls around something that might have been the most important connection of my life? The apartment was quiet except for the sound of Ellis moving around in the bathroom, getting ready for sleep. Soon he'd settle onto the couch that had become his bed, and I'd go to my own room, and we'd pretend that nothing significant had happened. But something had shifted, something I couldn't name but could feel in the space between us. For the first time in my adult life, I was more afraid of not taking a risk than I was of taking one. Days dissolved into weeks, and the boundaries of our separate lives began to blur in ways I hadn't expected and couldn't have planned for. What had started as Ellis crashing on my couch for a month became something else entirely, something that didn't have a name or an expiration date. His lease start date came and went without either of us mentioning it. The apartment we were supposed to look at together got forgotten in favor of a Tuesday afternoon spent organizing my book collection, Ellis sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading me passages from novels I'd owned for years but never opened. Ellis had always moved through the world with a kind of intentionality that I envied. But now that intentionality was focused on our daily life together, and the effect was transformative. He started bringing home groceries without being asked, appearing in the kitchen with ingredients for meals I'd never thought to make. Not just practical shopping, but small luxuries, good olive oil, fresh herbs, bread from the bakery across town that required a 20-minute detour from anywhere either of us actually needed to go. The first time he lit candles at dinner, I almost commented on it. We were eating something simple, pasta with vegetables and cheese, nothing that warranted ceremony. But Ellis had found candles I'd forgotten I owned, tucked away in a kitchen drawer since I'd moved in, and arranged them on the table like this was something we did regularly. The soft light changed everything about the meal, made it feel deliberate and special in a way that caught me off guard. I started to say something, to joke about the formality or ask what the occasion was. But Ellis looked so pleased with himself, so comfortable with the small ritual he'd introduced, that I let it pass. We ate by candlelight while he told me about a series of photographs he was planning, something about documenting the way different communities created gathering spaces in urban environments. I found myself asking more questions than usual, drawn in by his enthusiasm and the way the flickering light made his expressions more animated. After that, candles became part of our dinner routine. Ellis would light them without fanfare while I was finishing cooking, or I'd find them already burning when I came home from work, their warm glow transforming my practical little dining area into something that felt almost romantic. I never asked if that was intentional, and Ellis never explained. It became one of those things that simply belonged to us, another small way our separate lives were weaving together into something that looked increasingly like a shared one. Ellis had always been a good listener, but living together gave him access to different parts of me, parts one usually kept private. We'd be cleaning up after dinner or folding laundry, engaged in some mundane domestic task, and he'd ask questions that seemed to come from nowhere. About my childhood, about why I'd chosen archival work, about what I remembered about my parents before they divorced, about whether I'd always been as careful with people as I was now. These weren't interrogations or even formal conversations. They were gentle explorations, Ellis following threads of curiosity while we moved around each other in the small space of the apartment. He had a way of asking that made answering feel optional, made me feel like I could share as much or as little as I wanted without disappointing him. I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone. About how overwhelmed I'd felt as a child when my parents fought, how I'd learned to make myself small and quiet to avoid drawing attention to whatever was breaking down around me. About choosing a career that involved taking care of things that were already finished, already safe from further damage. About the relief I felt in my controlled, predictable life, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanied that relief. Ellis listened without interruption, without judgment, without trying to fix anything or offer advice. He'd nod occasionally or ask a clarifying question, but mostly he just let me talk until I'd said everything I needed to say. Afterward, he'd make some small observation that showed he'd been really listening, really thinking about what I'd shared. One evening, after I told him about a particularly difficult period in graduate school when I'd seriously considered quitting, he said I was nicer than I pretended to be. When I asked what he meant, he said I talked about myself like I was cold and selfish, but everything he'd observed suggested I was actually just careful, just trying to avoid causing harm. He said he thought I'd learned to protect other people by protecting myself, and that maybe it was time to consider whether that protection was still necessary. I didn't know how to respond to that level of insight into my own psychology, especially delivered so casually while Ellis was drying dishes and I was wiping down the counter. But I thought about it for days afterward, about whether he was right, about whether the walls I'd built around myself were still serving their original purpose or had simply become habit. Living in such close proximity, I became hyper-aware of all the small ways Ellis moved through space, all the tiny gestures and habits that revealed his comfort with physical closeness. When he passed behind me in the kitchen, his hand would briefly touch my shoulder or the small of my back. Not quite a caress, but more than necessary for simple navigation. When he handed me something, his fingers would linger against mine just a moment longer than practical. When we sat together on the couch, he'd gradually migrate closer throughout the evening, until we were sharing space in ways that felt both intentional and natural. I noticed how he said my name, too, not just when he was trying to get my attention, but when he was thinking out loud or telling me about his day. Julian, he'd say, you should have seen this building I photographed today, or Julian, do we have any of that tea left? My name in his voice started to sound different, like something fragile and important, like a word he was handling with particular care. The shift in how other people saw us became apparent at a party thrown by one of Ellis's photographer friends, someone I'd met briefly years earlier but didn't know well. Ellis had been reluctant to go, said he wasn't in the mood for small talk and performance, but the host had been persistent, and eventually we'd decided to make an appearance. I felt out of place immediately. The apartment was full of creative types who all seemed to know each other, who spoke in references and inside jokes I didn't understand. Ellis was better at navigating these social situations than I was, but even he seemed subdued, staying close to my side instead of working the room the way he usually did at gatherings. When someone Ellis knew approached us, a woman with elaborate tattoos and an expensive camera around her neck, Ellis introduced me in a way that surprised us both. This is Julian, he said. My person. Not my friend, not my roommate, not even my best friend. My person. I laughed it off, made some joke about being claimed like property, but the word stuck with me. The woman nodded like this made perfect sense and launched into a story about a project she was working on, but I was barely listening. I kept replaying Ellis's introduction, the casual certainty with which he described our relationship, the way my person had sounded both possessive and protective. We left the party earlier than we'd planned, both of us claiming tiredness, but really just wanting to be back in our own space, away from the noise and the need to explain ourselves to people who didn't know us well enough to understand. On the walk home, under the amber glow of streetlights, I finally asked Ellis what he'd meant by calling me his person. He was quiet for a few blocks, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, breath visible in the cold November air. When he finally answered, he just shrugged and said, "Isn't it obvious?" Like the question itself was unnecessary, like the answer was something I should have understood without asking. But it wasn't obvious to me, or maybe it was becoming obvious in ways that scared me. Back at the apartment, I found myself unable to settle into my usual evening routine. Ellis disappeared into the bathroom for his nightly ritual of teeth brushing and face washing, and I wandered around the living room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, turning off lights, and then turning them back on. I ended up in my bedroom, supposedly getting ready for sleep, but really just trying to understand what was happening to me, what had been happening for weeks now without me fully acknowledging it. I pulled out the journal I'd kept sporadically since college, pages and pages of thoughts and observations and attempts to make sense of my internal life. Flipping through the entries from the past few years, I was startled to discover how often Ellis's name appeared. Not in any context that seemed significant at the time, just casual mentions that now felt loaded with meaning I hadn't recognized. Ellis came by today. Ellis called from Portland. Ellis brought Chinese food, and we watched movies until late. Ellis is staying here while he sorts things out with Sarah. Page after page of Ellis's name scattered throughout my private thoughts like breadcrumbs marking a trail I hadn't realized I was following. References to conversations we'd had, plans we'd made, ways he'd surprised me or made me laugh or helped me through difficult periods. A pattern of connection and dependence that looked, in retrospect, like something much deeper than friendship. I closed the journal and lay down, but sleep felt impossible. My mind kept circling back to Ellis's casual my person, to the way he'd said, "Isn't it obvious?" to all the small intimacies that had developed between us over the weeks he'd been staying here. The shared meals and shared space, the way we'd learned to move around each other, the increasing physical closeness that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us seemed to seek out. When I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed about Ellis in ways that left me breathless and disoriented when I woke. Not sexual dreams exactly, but dreams full of tenderness and longing. Dreams where the distance between us had finally collapsed completely, where I was allowed to want him as openly as I was beginning to realize I already did. I woke up before my alarm, heart racing, with the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had shifted in how I understood what was happening between us. The careful balance we'd been maintaining, the unspoken boundaries that had allowed us to get this close without having to name what we were doing, felt suddenly unsustainable. In the gray light of early morning, with Ellis still asleep on the couch in the next room, I had to confront the possibility that I was falling in love with my best friend, and that maybe I had been for longer than I'd ever allowed myself to admit. The realization that I might be in love with Ellis should have changed everything. But instead it settled into my daily awareness like something that had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. I moved through the next few days hyper-conscious of every interaction between us, cataloging moments that suddenly seemed loaded with new meaning. The way Ellis's hand lingered on my shoulder when he passed behind me. How he'd started leaving his camera equipment in my bedroom instead of the living room, claiming the light was better by my window. The fact that we'd stopped talking about when he might find his own place, as if his temporary stay had transformed into something permanent without either of us making a conscious decision about it. A week after my journal revelation, the weather turned properly cold, the kind of December evening that made staying inside feel like a choice rather than a default. Rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity as the afternoon faded into evening. And by the time Ellis came home from a client meeting, the apartment felt like a warm island surrounded by weather that demanded we stay exactly where we were. Ellis kicked off his wet shoes by the door and hung his jacket on the hook I'd cleared for him weeks ago. His hair was damp from the short walk from his car to the building, and he ran his fingers through it while scanning the apartment for signs of how I'd spent my day. He found me in the kitchen, stirring something that had started as an attempt to use up vegetables before they went bad and had evolved into something more elaborate than either of us usually bothered with. He appeared at my shoulder, close enough that I could smell the cold air still clinging to his sweater, and asked what I was making. When I explained my improvised recipe, he suggested we open the bottle of wine someone had brought to the party we'd attended weeks earlier, the one that had been sitting on my counter ever since, waiting for an occasion that felt worthy of it. This felt worthy somehow, though I couldn't have explained why. The simple domestic pleasure of cooking together while rain pelted the windows, the way Ellis moved around my kitchen like he'd been doing it for years, the comfortable silence that had developed between us when we were focused on shared tasks. He opened the wine while I finished cooking, and we ate by candlelight again, listening to the storm and talking about small things that felt larger in the warm glow of the apartment. After dinner, Ellis suggested a movie. We'd fallen out of our regular movie night routine during the weeks when everything between us had been shifting, when sitting that close together on the couch had started to feel charged with possibility neither of us was ready to address directly. But tonight felt different. The storm outside, the wine, the way we'd been moving around each other all evening with increasing ease and familiarity, it all seemed to be leading somewhere we'd been circling around for months. Ellis chose something I'd never heard of, a quiet film from the 90s about two people who meet by chance and spend a single day together in a foreign city. The kind of movie that was more about atmosphere and unspoken connection than plot, where what didn't happen between the characters was as important as what did. I wondered if Ellis had chosen it deliberately, if he was trying to tell me something through the selection, but I didn't ask. We settled onto the couch with the same careful spacing we'd maintained since that first night when our knees had touched, but the careful spacing felt different now. Less like protection and more like anticipation, like we were both aware of the distance between us and the various ways it might be closed. The movie played, beautiful and melancholy, full of long looks and conversations that seemed to be about one thing, but were really about something else entirely. I found myself watching Ellis more than the screen, studying his profile in the shifting light, noticing how absorbed he seemed in the story unfolding in front of us. Rain continued to fall outside, steady and insistent, creating a cocoon of sound that made the apartment feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. Midway through the film, during a scene where the two main characters were walking through empty streets in the early morning light, Ellis shifted on the couch. Not the gradual migration that had characterized our previous movie nights, not the slow testing of boundaries that might be attributed to unconscious movement or simple comfort-seeking. This was deliberate, intentional, a decision made and acted upon before either of us could second-guess it. Ellis turned toward me and leaned his head against my chest, settling into the space between my shoulder and my heart, like he'd been planning this movement for weeks. My hand found its way to his hair without any conscious thought, fingers combing through the dark strands that were still slightly damp from the rain. He was warm and solid against me, and I could feel his breathing slow and deepen as he relaxed into the contact. We stayed like that for several minutes, both of us pretending to watch the movie while really paying attention to this new configuration of our bodies, this new level of intimacy that felt both completely natural and impossibly significant. The characters on screen continued their careful dance around each other, but I was focused entirely on the weight of Ellis's head against my chest, the way his breathing had synchronized with mine, the fact that for the first time since I'd known him, he felt completely still. Then Ellis spoke, his voice soft enough that I had to strain to hear it over the sound of the rain. He said he'd always wondered if I would pull away. Not just tonight, he clarified, but in general. In all the years we'd known each other, through all the moments when we'd gotten close to something that felt bigger than friendship, he'd always wondered if I would be the one to step back, to restore the careful distance that had kept us safe. My own voice, when I finally found it, was barely audible. I told him I'd never wanted to pull away. Not from him, not ever. What I'd been afraid of wasn't getting too close to Ellis, but of not being allowed to get close enough, of wanting something I couldn't have, of ruining what we already had by asking for more. Ellis lifted his head to look at me then, and in the blue light from the television, his expression was serious and searching. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either, and I felt something shift in the space between us. Not the careful, gradual shifting that had characterized the past few months, but something more final, more decisive. The movie continued playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. We sat facing each other on the couch, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in Ellis's dark eyes, close enough that if either of us had leaned forward just slightly, everything would have changed. But we didn't. Instead, we looked at each other in the flickering light while rain continued to fall outside, and let everything we'd been avoiding hang in the air between us. When the movie ended, the apartment fell into a quiet that felt different from any silence we'd shared before. The credits rolled, but neither of us moved to turn off the television or suggest that we should probably go to bed. Instead, we sat in the blue glow, still facing each other, still close enough to touch, but not quite touching. Both of us aware that we were balanced on the edge of something that couldn't be undone once we crossed it. Finally, I spoke the words I'd been circling around for weeks, maybe years. I told Ellis I thought I'd been in love with him longer than I'd known how to name it. That what I'd been feeling wasn't new, wasn't sudden, but had been building so gradually that I'd mistaken it for friendship, for loyalty, for any number of safer things that didn't require me to risk everything I valued most. Ellis was quiet for a long moment after I said this, quiet long enough that I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake, if I'd finally pushed too far and broken something precious and irreplaceable. But when he finally responded, his voice was steady and sure. He said maybe it was time we stopped trying to name what this was and just let it be what it had always been trying to become. That maybe we'd been so focused on protecting what we had that we'd forgotten to pay attention to what we wanted. That maybe we were already there, had been there for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. The rain outside was beginning to soften, but neither of us suggested moving, suggested that this conversation should end or that we should retreat to our separate spaces to process what had just been said. Instead, we sat in the warm light of the apartment while the storm gradually passed, finally able to look directly at what had been growing between us all along. We didn't kiss that night. Somehow, kissing would have felt like rushing, like skipping steps in a process that deserved to be savored. Instead, we sat together until late, talking quietly about things we'd never said out loud before, letting ourselves explore this new territory with the same careful attention we'd always paid to each other. When we finally did go to bed, Ellis to the couch and me to my room, something fundamental had shifted between us. We'd finally named what we were to each other, and the naming hadn't destroyed anything. If anything, it had made everything clearer, more honest, more possible than it had ever been before. 3 days after Ellis and I finally named what we were to each other, my sister called with news that forced us to consider what that naming meant in the larger world beyond my apartment. Claire had always been the more social of the two of us, the one who collected friends and experiences while I collected books and quiet evenings. She was getting married in the spring, she announced, and she wanted me to save the date. More than that, she wanted me to bring someone. She'd been gently pushing me toward relationships for years, expressing concern about my solitary lifestyle in the way that only siblings can, with love wrapped around judgment wrapped around genuine worry. This time felt different, though. She wasn't asking if I was seeing anyone or suggesting I might meet someone at the wedding. She was assuming I had someone to bring, and she wanted to meet them. I made appropriate congratulatory sounds and asked about venues and guest lists, but part of me was already thinking about what her assumption meant, what it would require of me if I wanted to honor it. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my phone, aware that this was the kind of moment that demanded a choice I'd been avoiding for years. Ellis found me there an hour later, still sitting with my phone in my hands, lost in thoughts I wasn't sure how to organize. He asked what was wrong, and I explained about Claire's call, about the wedding, about her expectation that I would bring a date. I didn't immediately explain why this felt complicated, but Ellis understood without me having to spell it out. For 2 days, we danced around the obvious question. We talked about everything else. Ellis's work, my latest archival project, what we should have for dinner, whether we needed to do laundry. But underneath all these ordinary conversations was the unasked question of whether what we'd acknowledged between us was something we were ready to share with other people, whether we were prepared to be Julian and Ellis, together, in a context where that togetherness would be seen and commented on and potentially judged. The wedding was still 3 months away, but Claire would want to know about guest counts soon, would want to plan seating arrangements and meal options. The longer I waited to ask Ellis, the more the question felt loaded with implications about what I expected from him, about how serious I thought we were, about whether I was brave enough to claim him publicly the way he'd claimed me as his person at that party weeks earlier. Finally, on a Tuesday evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, I found the courage to ask. Ellis was drying dishes while I wiped down the counter. Both of us focused on our tasks in a way that made the question feel less momentous somehow. I asked if he would come to Claire's wedding with me. Not as my friend, I clarified, though my eyes were fixed on the sponge in my hands rather than on his face. As my date. Ellis stopped drying the plate he was holding and looked at me directly. When I finally met his eyes, his expression was serious, searching, but not surprised. He asked if I was ready for that. Not whether he wanted to come, not whether he was free that weekend, but whether I was prepared for what bringing him as my date would mean. I thought about all the years I'd spent hiding from this possibility, all the relationships I'd kept at arm's length because they'd never felt like this, all the ways I'd convinced myself that the careful distance I maintained from everyone was protection rather than cowardice. I thought about Ellis sleeping on my couch like a ghost I'd never wanted to leave, about how empty my apartment felt when he wasn't in it, about the way my life had reorganized itself around his presence without any conscious decision on my part. I nodded. Yes, I was ready. The 3 months passed quickly, filled with the ordinary pleasures of living together without the careful boundaries we'd maintained for so long. Ellis moved his remaining belongings from storage into my apartment without fanfare, and we stopped referring to the couch as his bed. We learned how to sleep in the same room, how to navigate morning routines that involved 2 people, how to make decisions together about everything from what to watch on television to which groceries to buy. The wedding itself was both exactly as awkward as I'd anticipated and somehow easier than I'd feared. Claire had chosen a venue outside the city, a renovated barn surrounded by fields that were just beginning to turn green with early spring growth. Ellis wore a suit I'd never seen before, dark gray that made his eyes look almost black, and when we walked into the reception together, I felt the familiar flutter of awareness that accompanied being seen as part of a couple. Some conversations were easier than others. Claire's friends, people I'd met briefly at various family gatherings over the years, seemed genuinely happy to meet Ellis, asking about his photography and his travel without prying into the specifics of our relationship. My relatives were more complicated. My father, whom I saw rarely and who had never shown much interest in my personal life, shook Ellis's hand with polite confusion, clearly uncertain about what Ellis's presence meant. My mother asked careful questions that felt like attempts to understand without giving offense, and I found myself stumbling through explanations that felt both too detailed and inadequate. Ellis handled all of it with grace I couldn't have managed on my own. He answered questions about his work with enthusiasm, deflected more personal inquiries with gentle humor, and stayed close enough to me that I could feel his presence as support without feeling like he was hovering or protecting me from conversations I needed to navigate myself. By the time dinner was served, I'd relaxed into the rhythm of the evening, into the strange pleasure of being Ellis's date in a context where that meant something specific and public. We sat at a table with some of Claire's college friends, people who treated our relationship as unremarkable, who included both of us in conversations about travel and work and shared memories from Claire's past that Ellis had never heard before. But the moment I remembered most clearly came later, after the formal reception had wound down and most of the older relatives had left. Ellis and I had stepped outside for air, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd and the sustained effort of being social for so many hours. The venue had a wraparound porch with string lights that cast everything in warm gold, and music from inside drifted out through open windows. Without discussing it, We found ourselves moving together to the faint sound of whatever song was playing inside. Not really dancing, more like swaying in place. Ellis's arms around my waist and my hands on his shoulders, both of us tired and happy and relieved to have survived the day without any major disasters. There was no one else outside, no audience for this moment, which made it feel both more intimate and more honest than anything that had happened during the formal celebration. Standing there under the porch lights, moving slowly to music we could barely hear, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, something I'd almost forgotten was possible. Peace. Not just contentment or satisfaction, but actual peace, the sense that I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person, doing exactly what I was meant to be doing. Later, in the quiet guest room Claire had reserved for us at a bed and breakfast down the road, Ellis and I sat on the edge of the bed, both of us drained from the long day, but somehow reluctant to let it end. We'd shared hotel rooms before, during college trips and occasional visits to see Ellis's family, but this felt different. We were here together by choice, as a couple, in a context where sharing a bed was expected rather than a practical arrangement. Ellis was sitting beside me, close enough that our knees were touching, looking down at his hands. I could see that he was as uncertain as I was about how to navigate this new territory, how to move from the public acknowledgement of our relationship back to the private intimacy we'd been building over months of living together. When I finally kissed him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Not desperate or urgent, not the culmination of months of denied attraction, but simply the next logical step in a conversation we'd been having all evening, all spring, all the years we'd known each other. Ellis's response was immediate and sure, his hand coming up to cradle my face like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. Nothing inside me resisted. No voice of caution, no internal argument about what this meant or where it might lead, no fear about crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For the first time in my adult life, wanting something and allowing myself to have it felt like the same impulse, and the relief of that alignment was almost overwhelming. We kissed until we were both breathless, until the careful control I'd maintained over my feelings for Ellis finally dissolved completely. When we finally pulled apart, Ellis rested his forehead against mine and said my name like it was something precious he'd been holding for safekeeping. I understood then that this wasn't the beginning of something new between us. It was the acknowledgement of something that had been true for longer than either of us had been willing to admit, something that had been waiting patiently for us to become brave enough to claim it. 6 months later, on a Thursday evening in October, I found myself moving around the kitchen in bare feet, humming something I couldn't identify while I waited for water to boil for tea. The apartment looked different now, lived in ways it had never been when it was just mine. Ellis's camera equipment had claimed permanent space on the coffee table, mixed in with books we were both reading and the detritus of shared daily life. Blankets we'd accumulated over the months were draped across the couch, and a bowl from last night's popcorn sat forgotten on the side table, evidence of movie nights that no longer felt like events, but simply part of the rhythm we'd established together. The refrigerator had become a gallery of sorts, covered with photos Ellis had taken during his recent assignments, grocery lists written in both our handwriting, and tucked among them, a blurry snapshot of the two of us that Ellis had captured one afternoon when I wasn't paying attention. In the photo, we're both laughing at something I can't remember now, leaning into each other on the couch, and I look more relaxed than I'd ever seen myself before. Ellis had printed it without asking and stuck it there one morning, and I'd left it up because seeing it reminded me daily of how much had changed, how much I'd been willing to let change. Ellis appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair sticking up in several directions from the nap he'd taken after coming home from a client meeting. His voice was still soft with sleep when he asked what we were watching tonight, the question delivered with the casual assumption that of course we were spending the evening together, of course we'd settled back into our movie night tradition, even though everything about those nights had been transformed. I handed him the remote without looking away from the tea I was preparing, smiling at the familiar domestic negotiation we'd perfected over months of shared evenings. Ellis accepted it with the same easy grace he brought to most of our daily interactions now. The careful politeness of our early cohabitation replaced by something more natural, more automatic. We learned each other's preferences and rhythms in ways that no longer surprised me. Ellis knew I preferred to choose the first movie while he handled the second, that I liked to have tea during evening films while he preferred wine or beer, that I needed a few minutes of quiet when I first got home from work before I was ready for conversation. I'd learned that Ellis was most creative in the late afternoon, that he processed his day by talking through the details while he moved around the apartment, that he was happiest when he had a project to work on with his hands while we watched television. Tonight felt no different from dozens of other nights we'd shared since returning from Claire's wedding, since the shift that had happened in that guest room had settled into something comfortable and sustainable. We curled up on the couch with our respective drinks, Ellis's legs tangled with mine, his hand resting on my knee in the absent way that had become second nature to both of us. But this time, there was no shifting closer throughout the evening, no gradual migration toward greater intimacy. We were already as close as we wanted to be, already touching in all the ways that mattered. The careful choreography of our early movie nights, the tentative exploration of boundaries, and the fear of pushing too far had been replaced by the easy familiarity of people who no longer had to wonder what the other person wanted or whether their affection was reciprocated. The movie Ellis chose was something I'd never heard of, a quiet European film about two people who meet in a bookstore and spend the afternoon walking through a city, talking about art and loneliness and the different ways people construct meaning in their lives. It was exactly the kind of film Ellis gravitated toward, thoughtful and visually beautiful, the sort of story that invited you to pay attention to the spaces between dialogue, to what was communicated through glances and silences. I found myself thinking, as I often did during our evening rituals, about how much had changed since those first tentative movie nights when we were both so careful not to acknowledge what was building between us. Not just the physical ease we developed, though that was part of it, but the deeper sense of security that came from finally being able to want what I had, to love someone without the constant low-level anxiety that it might be taken away or revealed as a mistake. Ellis shifted beside me, not seeking greater closeness, but simply settling more deeply into the comfort of our shared space. His fingers traced absent patterns on my knee while he watched the screen, and I felt the same profound contentment I'd experienced that night on the porch at Claire's wedding. The sense of being exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person, doing exactly what felt most natural and true. When the credits rolled, we didn't immediately move to clean up or discuss what we'd watched or make plans for tomorrow. We simply sat together in the soft light of the apartment, comfortable with the silence, comfortable with each other, comfortable with the life we'd built together without ever quite planning to build it. Later, I would think about this evening as one of the moments when I understood most clearly what we'd found together. Not the dramatic declarations, or the first kiss, or the public recognition of our relationship, but this quiet Thursday night when everything felt exactly as it should be. When the careful distance I'd spent years maintaining felt like a memory from someone else's life, and the space between Ellis and me had become the space we shared, the place we'd both been heading all along without knowing it. We were home, not just in the apartment, though that was part of it, but in each other, in the rhythm we'd created together, in the understanding that this was what we'd been moving toward through all those years of friendship and careful boundaries and unspoken longing. We were finally, completely, exactly where we belonged.